The doors to the Galactic Council chambers opened with a soft hiss. Ambassador Day-Ho stepped inside, his simple black uniform looking plain against the grand hall filled with creatures from across the galaxy. The ceiling stretched high above, him, covered in stars that showed the homeworlds of every species in the council. But right now all those stars seemed to be looking down at him with judgment. Day-Ho was not impressive to look at. He stood about average height for a human, with dark hair cut short and kind eyes behind simple glasses. His hands were soft, not scarred from battle like the warriors around him. He carried no weapons, wore no armor, and had no visible enhancements or modifications. To everyone watching, he looked exactly like what he was, an ordinary human diplomat. Chamber buzzed with whispers and clicking sounds as dozens of alien species turned to stare at him. Near the front sat the Vorthak delegation, massive beings with skin that looked like living crystal. Their leader, Counselor Vex Thor, was 3 times taller than any human, and his arms were thick as tree trunks. When he moved, his crystalline skin caught the light and threw rainbow patterns across the walls. Behind them sat the Nimari scouts, quick creatures with 6 arms and legs that could move faster than most eyes could follow. Their leader, Scout Prime Zara, had silver skin that seemed to flow like liquid metal. She tapped 4 of her hands on the table in a rhythm that sounded like rain on glass. The Kelthran delegation occupied floating chairs near the center of the room. Their large heads housed brains twice the size of human ones, and their eyes glowed with the soft blue light that showed they were reading minds. Their speaker, Mind Touch Keela, looked at Day-Ho and shook his head slowly. Other species filled the remaining seats. The rock-like Gorvani who could survive in the vacuum of space. The plant-based Sylvani, whose bodies produced their own food from sunlight. The energy beings called Luminari, who existed as pure thought wrapped in controlled lightning. Each one was remarkable in their own way, evolved for survival in ways humans could barely imagine. And then there was Day-Ho, representing humanity. Just a man in a plain suit carrying a simple datapad. Counselor Vex Thor rose from his seat, his crystal body reflecting light in all directions. When he spoke, his voice rumbled like distant thunder. "So this is what the humans send us," he said, making no effort to hide his disgust. "When the greatest threat in galactic history approaches our worlds, when the Shadow Fleet destroys everything in its path, Earth sends us this weak creature." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Scout Prime Zara's 6 arms gestured dismissively. Humans are the weakest species to ever achieve space travel. No natural weapons, no enhanced senses, no special abilities. What could they possibly contribute to our defense? Mind Touch Keela's mental voice echoed in everyone's head. I scan his thoughts and find nothing remarkable. No hidden powers, no secret knowledge. Just ordinary human emotions and ideas. Day-Ho listened to all of this without changing expression. He had expected this reaction. Humans had been part of the Galactic Council for only 50 years, and in that time they had never proven themselves in the ways other species valued. They could not lift massive weights like the Gorvani. They could not run at impossible speeds, like the Nimari. They could not read minds like the Kelthran or survive in harsh environments like dozens of other species. But Day-Ho was not here to prove human strength in those ways. Next to him sat his aide, Jiwoo, a young woman who had graduated from the Diplomatic Academy just 2 years ago. She whispered urgently in his ear, "Ambassador, they are insulting not just you but all of humanity. We should file formal complaints. We should demand respect according to council protocols." Day-Ho turned to her with a gentle smile. "Filing complaints will not change their minds, Jiwoo. Let them speak. Sometimes listening teaches us more than talking." The insults continued. A delegate from the warlike Thrakari species stood up, his 4 arms crossed over his muscular chest. "Humans have no warrior tradition worth mentioning. In a real fight, one of my people could defeat 100 of theirs." A Sylvani representative, her bark-like skin rough with age, added her voice to the chorus. "Their technology is borrowed from other species. Their science is centuries behind ours. Even their art lacks the complexity we see from truly advanced civilizations. But through all of this, Deho simply watched and listened. He observed how each species sat, how they moved, how they interacted with each other. He noticed that the Vorthak always positioned themselves to show their strongest side to potential rivals. He saw how the Namari kept multiple hands near concealed weapons even in a peaceful setting. He watched the Kelthran constantly probe the thoughts of others, never fully trusting what people said aloud. Most importantly, he noticed their fear. Because, underneath all the insults and displays of strength, every being in that chamber was terrified. The Shadow Fleet had been attacking worlds across the Outer Rim for 6 months now. Entire colonies had been wiped out, leaving behind only empty cities and no survivors to tell what had happened. The few witnesses who had escaped spoke in whispers about dark ships that seemed to be alive and a creature of living shadow that hunted down anyone who tried to flee. They called it the Void Stalker, and it was the reason all these proud species were gathered here today despite their hatred for each other. Fear had forced them to work together, but fear had also made them desperate for someone to blame, someone weaker than themselves to look down upon, and Deho understood this completely. When the formal session began, and he was called to address the council, Deho stood slowly. The chamber fell silent, waiting to hear what the weak human could possibly say to justify his presence among such powerful beings. "Honored delegates," Deho began, his voice calm and clear. "I do not come here to claim that humans are strong. You are correct that we cannot match your physical abilities, your mental powers, or your technological achievements." This admission caused surprised murmurs throughout the chamber. Most species would have tried to argue for their strengths, not openly admit their weaknesses. "But I do not believe strength alone will solve the crisis we face," Deho continued. "The Shadow Fleet has defeated every military force sent against them. The Void Stalker has proven immune to every weapon we have tried. Perhaps it is time to consider a different approach." "And what approach would that be?" Vexthor demanded. "What can your weak species offer that our mighty warriors cannot provide?" Deho looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of as many delegates as possible. "Understanding," he said simply. "We propose a cultural exchange program, not military alliance, not technology sharing, but learning about each other. Learning about our fears, our hopes, our ways of seeing the universe." The silence that followed this proposal lasted only a few seconds before the entire chamber erupted in laughter. The sound was deafening, a mixture of clicks, roars, musical tones, and sounds that human ears could barely process. Even the usually serious Kelthran projected waves of amusement that everyone could feel. "Cultural exchange?" Scout Prime Zara's voice was high with disbelief. "The Shadow Fleet destroys worlds and you want to share stories and songs?" "The Void Stalker hunts down our bravest warriors," added the Thrakari delegate. "And you think understanding will protect us," but Deho did not back down. "Every great conflict in galactic history has ended, not with the complete destruction of one side, but with understanding between former enemies. Even now, species that once fought wars against each other sit together in this chamber. Because the strong defeated the weak," Vexthor rumbled. "Victory brought peace, not conversation." Deho shook his head gently. "Victory brought temporary quiet. Understanding brought lasting peace. There is a difference." The laughter continued for several more minutes. Delegates mocked the human proposal as naive, calling it the desperate idea of a species too weak to contribute anything meaningful to the defense effort. Jiwoo looked embarrassed and angry at the treatment her ambassador was receiving, but Deho remained calm. When Council Leader Morketh, an ancient being whose species had founded the Council itself, finally called for order, the decision was already clear. The proposal for cultural exchange was rejected by a vote of 47-1, with only Earth supporting it. "The human delegation may remain as observers," Morketh announced in his creaking voice, "but they will not be included in military, planning, or resource allocation. This crisis requires strength, not sentiment." As the session ended and the delegates began filing out, many of them continued to make jokes about the naive humans who thought they could stop a galactic threat with friendship and understanding. But Deho noticed something else as he watched them leave. Despite all their boasting about strength and power, despite all their advanced weapons and abilities. Every single one of them looked frightened. They were all desperately hoping that someone else would find a solution to the Shadow Fleet, because their own strength had already proven insufficient. And in that fear, Daeho saw the beginning of possibility, because humans understood fear very well indeed. They had lived with it for their entire history, and they had learned something that these powerful species had not. Sometimes the greatest strength came from admitting weakness. Sometimes the best solution came. 3 weeks after the council meeting, Daeho stood in his small quarters aboard Nexus Station, looking out at the busy traffic of ships coming and going. The massive trade hub was like a small city floating in space, home to over 2 million beings from hundreds of different worlds. Ships of every size and shape docked at its ports, bringing goods, people, and news from across the galaxy. Daeho had come to the station for routine trade negotiations, the kind of boring work that most diplomats handled between the big, important meetings. He was discussing shipping routes for human agricultural products with a group of Nimari merchants when the first alarms began to sound. The lights in the conference room flickered, then turned red. An announcement echoed through the station in dozens of languages. All beings proceed to evacuation stations immediately. This is not a drill. The Shadow Fleet has been detected approaching our location. The Nimari merchants were gone before the announcement finished, their 6 limbs carrying them away faster than Daeho could blink. He moved more slowly toward the evacuation routes, helping other beings who seemed confused or frightened by the chaos. The corridors filled with panic as millions of creatures tried to reach the escape pods and transport ships. Daeho saw families, separated in the rush, elderly beings knocked down by the crowd, children crying for parents they could no longer see. The station's security forces tried to maintain order, but even they looked terrified. Then the lights went out completely. Emergency lighting kicked in a few seconds later, casting everything in a dim red glow that made shadows dance on the walls. Through the station's transparent sections, Daeho could see the Shadow Fleet ships approaching. They looked nothing like normal spacecraft. Instead of metal and clean lines, these vessels seemed to be alive. Their hulls pulsed like beating hearts, and they moved through space with the fluid grace of swimming creatures. The attack began without warning. Weapons that looked more like living tentacles than cannons reached out from the Shadow Fleet ships and tore through the station's defenses. The protective shields that should have held for hours collapsed in minutes. Sections of the station began to lose atmosphere, and more alarms added their voices to the chaos. Daeho found himself cut off from the main evacuation routes when a section of corridor collapsed. Emergency barriers dropped, sealing off entire areas of the station. He was not alone, though. Around him were about 30 other beings who had also been trapped, mostly civilians who had been visiting the station rather than living there. There was an elderly Kelthran couple, their mind glow dim with exhaustion. A family of Gorvani, their rock-like skin cracked from stress. Several Nimari children who had been separated from their parents during the evacuation. A group of Silvani traders whose bark was turning dark with fear. And others, all looking to each other for guidance that none of them could provide. "The emergency shelters are this way," said one of the Gorvani, pointing down a corridor that led deeper into the station. "We should hide until the attack is over." "No," replied a Nimari adult, her silver skin flickering with nervous energy. "We need to find another way to the evacuation bays. Hiding will just trap us here if the station is destroyed." Arguments broke out among the group as fear took hold. Each species wanted to follow their own instincts for survival. The Gorvani wanted to find the strongest shelter and wait. The Nimari wanted to run fast and find another escape route. The Kelthran wanted to use their mental abilities to contact rescuers telepathically. But Daeho did something different. He sat down on the floor, opened his small travel bag, and began pulling out food packages. "Anyone hungry?" he asked calmly, as if they were not in the middle of a deadly attack. The others stared at him in disbelief. A Gorvani child stepped forward hesitantly, and Daeho handed him a package of dried fruit. "It's sweet," he said with a smile. "My grandmother always said sweet food helps when you're scared." Slowly, other beings began to approach. Daeho shared his food with everyone, even though he did not have very much. He spoke quietly to each person, learning their names, asking about their families, listening to their fears. The elderly Kelthran couple told him about their grandchildren. The Silvani traders shared stories about their home gardens. The Nimari children stopped crying and began eating the human food with curiosity. "Why are you not afraid?" asked one. Of the young Nimari, a girl named Sila whose silver skin had stopped flickering with panic. Deho considered the question seriously. "I am afraid," he said honestly. "But being afraid doesn't help anyone. Taking care of each other does help." As if to prove him wrong, the corridor filled with darkness so complete that their emergency lights seemed to die. The temperature dropped until they could see their breath, and a sound like wind through a graveyard echoed around them. Everyone pressed closer together, instinctively seeking comfort in numbers. Then it appeared. The Void Stalker materialized. At the far end of the corridor, like a nightmare made real, it stood 3 meters tall, its body a writhing mass of living shadow that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Where it had eyes, burning stars glowed with cold fire. Tendrils of darkness reached out from its form, passing through the walls as if they were not there. Every being in the corridor froze with terror. This was the creature that had hunted down the galaxy's greatest warriors. This was the monster that entire fleets had failed to stop. And now it was here, with them, in this small trapped space with nowhere to run. The Void Stalker began to move toward them, and several of the aliens whimpered in fear. Others closed their eyes, not wanting to see their death approaching. The Kelthran couple tried to use their telepathy to call for help, but their mental voices seemed to be absorbed by the creature's darkness. But Deho did something that no one expected. He stood up and walked toward the Void Stalker. Not to attack it, because he had no weapons and no powers that could hurt such a being. Not to run, because there was nowhere to go. He walked toward it calmly, his hands empty and open, and when he was close enough to feel the cold radiating from its form, he began to speak. But he did not speak in Galactic Standard, the common language that all species use to communicate. Instead, he spoke in Korean, his native human language. Words that none of the other beings could understand, but that somehow seemed to carry meaning beyond mere sounds. "You look tired," he said softly in Korean, his voice steady despite the terror he felt. "I can see it in the way you move, in the way your light flickers. Everyone runs from you. Everyone fears you. But has anyone ever asked what you're running from?" The Void Stalker stopped moving. For the first time in recorded galactic history, the most feared predator in known space hesitated, its burning eyes fixed on Deho, and its form rippled with what might have been confusion. Deho continued speaking, still in Korean, his words flowing like water over stones. He spoke of loneliness, of carrying burdens too heavy to share, of being misunderstood and feared when all you wanted was to protect others. He did not know if the creature could understand his words, but somehow he felt that it could understand his intention. Images began to flow into Deho's mind, not through telepathy like the Kelthran used, but through something deeper and more fundamental. He saw flashes of the Void Stalker's past, glimpses of what it had once been before darkness consumed it. A guardian of some lost world, transformed against its will into a weapon of destruction. Centuries of loneliness, of being feared and hated for actions it could not control. The other survivors watched in amazement as the temperature began to warm and the oppressive darkness started to lift. The Void Stalker's form became less aggressive, its burning eyes less angry and more curious. Then, through the station's communication system, came the sound they had all been waiting for, the Shadow Fleet's retreat signal, a haunting melody that seemed to call all their forces back to their ships. The attack was ending. The Void Stalker turned toward the sound, preparing to leave, but it paused and looked back at Deho one final time. In that gaze was something none of them had ever expected to see: recognition, and perhaps the beginning of understanding. Then it was gone, fading back into shadow as if it had never been there. The survivors sat in stunned silence for several minutes before rescue teams finally cut through the barriers and found them. When the security forces asked what had happened, why they were all alive when the Void Stalker had been detected in their area, Most of them could only stare and point at the human, who had somehow spoken to the darkness and lived. Daeho helped carry the injured to the medical bays and made sure every survivor found their families before he finally contacted Jiwoo to let her know he was safe. He did not talk about what had happened with the Void Stalker, but word spread quickly through the station's survivors. The galaxy's most feared monster had spared a group of civilians after speaking with a single, ordinary human. And for the first time since the Shadow Fleet attacks began, people started to wonder if there might be another way to end this war besides fighting. News of what happened on Nexus Station spread across the galaxy faster than light-speed communication networks could carry it. Within hours, every major world knew that Ambassador Daeho had somehow survived a direct encounter with the Void Stalker. Within days, the story had grown into legend. Most species dismissed it as impossible. The Vorthak Military Command issued statements saying their crystal-skinned warriors would have handled the situation with proper combat techniques. The Nimari, speedfighters, claimed that running away would have been the smart choice, not standing still and talking. The Kelthran mind readers admitted they had tried many times to communicate with the Void Stalker telepathically, but had always failed to make any meaningful contact. But then something strange began happening across the galaxy. On the mining colony of Kepler 442b, engineer Tai Sung was working deep underground when the Shadow Fleet attacked. Like many humans, he had heard the news from Nexus Station and wondered if it could possibly be true. When the Void Stalker appeared in the tunnel where he was trapped, Tai Sung found himself facing the same choice Daeho had made. He could have tried to run through the mining tunnels, but the creature was faster than any human could move. He could have tried to fight, but he had only simple tools against a being that had defeated entire armies. Instead, Taesung sat down next to his equipment and began to sing. The songs were old Korean folk songs his grandmother had taught him when he was a child. Songs about mountains and rivers, about farmers working in fields, about families gathered around fires on cold nights. He sang in Korean, just as Daeho had spoken in Korean, and somehow the meaning seemed to carry beyond the words. The Void Stalker listened, its form becoming less agitated with each verse. When the Shadow Fleet retreat signal sounded, the creature left without harming anyone in the mining complex. Taesung was found hours later, still sitting by his equipment, still singing softly to himself. On Vega Station, Merchant Sujin was protecting a nursery full of alien children when the attack came. The regular caregivers had evacuated, leaving behind youngsters from 6 different species who were too scared to move. When the Void Stalker appeared, Sujin did what felt natural to her. She offered it food, simple rice and vegetables from her personal supplies, the kind of basic meal her mother had made for her family back on Earth. She held out the bowl with steady hands, speaking quietly in Korean about taking care of others, about the importance of eating together, about how sharing food was how strangers became friends. The creature took the bowl, and for a moment its burning eyes seemed almost confused. It did not eat the food, but it held the bowl carefully until the retreat signal came. When it left, every child in the nursery was safe. Similar encounters happened on 3 more worlds. Each time, a human faced the Void Stalker not with weapons or tricks, but with simple acts of kindness and understanding. Each time, the creature responded with something that looked almost like curiosity instead of its usual aggression. The Galactic Council called an emergency session, and this time they listened much more carefully when Daeho spoke. The human. Ambassador had been studying every report, looking for patterns that the other species had missed while focusing on military solutions. "You have all been approaching this as a war," Daeho explained to the assembled representatives, his voice calm but firm. "But what if it is not a war? What if the Shadow Fleet, what if the Void Stalker itself, is as much a victim as those it has been forced to hunt?" The council chamber erupted with the usual protests. Councillor Vexthor's crystal body flashed with angry light. "Victim? That monster has destroyed entire colonies. And yet it spares groups that include humans," Daeho replied. "Why? What are we doing differently that makes it hesitate?" Scout Prime Zara leaned forward, her 6 arms clicking on the table. "You think you can talk to it like a person? It is a weapon of destruction, nothing more. Every person is capable of destruction, Dae-ho said quietly. That does not mean destruction is all they are capable of. Mind Touch Keela's mental voice filled the room with skepticism. Even if communication is possible, how can we trust such a dangerous being? How do we know this is not some trick to make us lower our defenses? For the first time, Dae-ho smiled. Because trust is not something you give or receive. Trust is something you build, one small act at a time, and everyone deserves the chance to show who they really are. Admiral Hyejin, attending the session via hologram from Earth's orbital command station, stepped forward. Unlike the alien representatives, she had been studying the encounter reports with great interest. As the head of Earth's Space Forces, she understood something the others had missed. We propose a joint mission, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions. Not to destroy the Shadow Fleet, but to communicate with it, to understand what they want and why they are doing this. The proposal caused an uproar. Species after species stood to voice their objections. The idea of approaching their greatest enemy with words instead of weapons seemed like madness to beings who had spent centuries solving problems through superior strength or technology. But the mounting evidence was impossible to ignore. 5 separate encounters, 5 human survivors, 5 instances where the galaxy's most feared predator had chosen mercy over violence. Even the most skeptical delegates had to admit that something was happening that their traditional methods could not explain. After hours of debate, the Council reached a compromise. They would allow a small diplomatic mission to attempt contact with the Shadow Fleet. The mission would be led by humans, since they seemed to have the best chance of survival, but it would include representatives from other species as witnesses. Dae-ho accepted the leadership role, knowing that failure would likely mean death not just for himself but for everyone who accompanied him. The mission would include Jiwoo as his aide, the other human survivors who had encountered the Void Stalker, and delegates from each major species who were brave enough or curious enough to risk their lives for the chance to understand their enemy. But even as the plans were being made, changes were already happening that none of them knew about. Deep in the darkness at the edge of known space, the Shadow Fleet had received reports of these strange encounters. The bioships pulsed with new rhythms as they communicated with each other in ways that no other species understood. And at the heart of it all, the Void Stalker itself was changing. The brief contacts with humans had awakened something in its ancient mind, something that had been buried under centuries of violence and pain. Memories were surfacing, memories of what it had been before the darkness consumed it. It remembered, protecting instead of destroying. It remembered creating instead of ending. It remembered what it felt like to be thanked instead of feared. For the first time in hundreds of years, the Void Stalker was remembering what it meant to hope. The diplomatic mission would launch in 1 week, heading for the Shadow Fleet's staging area at the edge of the Magellan Void. None of the participants knew what they would find there, or if they would survive long enough to make contact. But they were about to discover that the greatest battles were not always fought with weapons, and that the most important victories came not from defeating enemies, but from helping them remember who they used to be. The galaxy was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous monsters were just lost souls waiting for someone to show them the way home. The diplomatic vessel Harmony was unlike any ship the galaxy had ever seen. Built through the combined efforts of dozens of species, it represented both their greatest cooperation and their deepest fears. The hull was made from Gorvani stone metal that could survive almost any attack. The engines used Nimari speed technology for quick escapes. The navigation systems included Kelthran mind interfaces for precise control. Even the life support systems were designed to keep beings from 20 different species alive and comfortable. But despite all this advanced technology, the most important equipment on the ship was much simpler. A small kitchen where the human crew prepared food, a meditation room where they practiced breathing exercises, and a common area filled with comfortable chairs where people could sit and talk. Commander Zeph Cole of the Vorthak delegation spent most of his time questioning the wisdom of their mission. His crystal skin flashed with frustrated colors as he paced the ship's corridors. "We should be bringing weapons, not words," he insisted to anyone who would listen. "The Shadow Fleet respects only strength." The Nimari representative, Scout Prime, Velthi, used her 6 arms to constantly calculate escape routes and defensive positions. Her silver skin flickered with nervous energy as she ran scenarios through her enhanced mind. "We are flying toward the most dangerous enemy in the galaxy, with no way to protect ourselves," she muttered. Even Mindspeaker Kel'Nus, the Kelthron delegate whose mental abilities were considered among the strongest of his species, admitted that the psychic emanations from their destination were unlike anything he had ever experienced. "Their thoughts are wrong," he said, his large eyes glowing with worry. "Not evil, but damaged somehow, broken in ways I cannot understand." Only the humans seemed calm as they approached the Shadow Fleet's territory. Daiho spent his time in meditation, practicing the breathing techniques his grandfather had taught him decades ago. Taesung worked in the ship's small workshop, building simple mechanical devices with his hands while humming the folk songs that had saved him in the mining tunnels. Sujin prepared traditional Korean meals in the kitchen, filling the ship with the smells of home. The other human survivors from the Void Stalker encounters were equally peaceful. Engineer Minho drew sketches of his family back on Earth. Dr. Kyung-ah practiced traditional Korean calligraphy, her brushstrokes flowing like water on paper. Teacher Boram told stories to the younger crew members, tales from human history about people who had faced impossible situations with courage and kindness. Their apparent serenity in the face of approaching doom confused and sometimes angered their alien companions. How could being so weak seem so unafraid when facing the galaxy's greatest threat? The answer came when they finally reached the edge of Magellan Void, the dark, empty region of space where the Shadow Fleet had established its base. As the Harmony dropped out of hyperspace, everyone aboard got their first close look at their destination. The Shadow Fleet was even more disturbing up close than in the reports. The bioships were clearly alive, pulsing with their own heartbeats and moving with organic grace that no mechanical vessel could match. Each ship was unique, as if it had grown rather than been built. Some looked like enormous sea creatures, adapted for space. Others resembled giant insects or plants. All of them radiated a sense of ancient sadness that even the non-telepathic crew members could feel. But it was the largest ship at the center of the fleet that drew everyone's attention. It was less a vessel than a living world, its surface covered in what looked like cities or forests. Lights moved across its hull in patterns that seemed almost like writing, as if the ship itself were trying to communicate. "Receiving transmission," reported the communications officer, a young Silvani whose bark-like skin had turned pale with fear. It is not in any known language." The transmission filled the ship's speakers with sounds unlike anything in galactic databases. Not the clicks and whistles of typical alien languages, but something deeper. Music mixed with mathematics, poetry combined with technical specifications, emotions given form in ways that bypassed normal understanding. But Daiho stood up slowly, his eyes wide with recognition. "It is a greeting," he said softly. "They are welcoming us." "How can you possibly know that?" Commander Zefkol demanded, his crystal form flashing with disbelief. "Because I have heard something like it before," Daiho replied, thinking of the images that had flowed into his mind during his encounter with the Void Stalker. Not the words, but the feeling behind them. They are lonely, and they are surprised that anyone came to visit instead of to fight. As if responding to his words, the transmission changed. The complex sound simplified into something that seemed almost like a question. Before anyone could object, Daiho moved to the communications console and activated the ship's transmitter. He spoke in Korean, his voice calm and gentle. He introduced himself and his companions, explained that they had come to talk rather than to fight, and asked for permission to approach closer. He did not know if the Shadow Fleet could understand his words, but he hoped they could understand his intentions. The response was immediate. The bioships around them began to move, not in the aggressive formations they had shown in battle, but in graceful patterns that looked almost like a dance. They were being escorted, not attacked. As the Harmony moved deeper into the Shadow Fleet formation, the alien crew members stared in amazement at what they saw. The bioships were not just vessels but homes. Through transparent sections of their living hulls, they could see gardens growing inside, chambers filled with beings they had never seen before, and activities that looked more like daily life than military preparation. "These are refugees," whispered Scout Prime Velthi, her 6 arms stilled by wonder. "They are not invaders. They are people looking for new homes." The largest ship opened a docking bay that looked more like a flower blooming than a mechanical chore. As the Harmony settled inside, the crew could see that they were not entering a military vessel, but something closer to a city. Buildings grew from the ship's living walls, connected by bridges that looked like tree branches. Gardens provided fresh air and food. Beings of dozens of unknown species moved about their daily lives, many of them stopping to stare at the strange, diplomatic vessel with curiosity rather than hostility. And standing at the center of the docking bay, waiting for them with something that might have been patience, was the Void Stalker. But it looked different than in the battle reports. Less like a weapon of destruction, and more like what it truly was. A guardian that had been fighting for so long it had forgotten what it was supposed to be protecting. When the airlock opened and Daiho stepped out, followed by his human companions, and the nervous alien delegates, the Void Stalker approached them slowly. Its burning eyes fixed on the human diplomat, and when it spoke, its voice carried the weight of centuries. "You came," it said in perfect galactic standard, though its words seemed to echo with deeper meanings, despite the fear, despite the warnings, despite every reason to stay away. "You came to talk." Daiho bowed slightly, a gesture of respect from his human culture. "We came because everyone deserves to be heard," he said simply. "And because we believe that most conflicts come from misunderstanding, not true evil." The creature that had terrorized the galaxy for months studied this small human for a long moment. Then, to the amazement of everyone present, the Void Stalker's form began to change. The writhing shadows solidified into something more stable, the burning eyes softened to a gentler glow, and its voice lost some of its terrible edge. "Then listen," it said, "and we will tell you the truth about why we are here. But be warned. The truth may be more difficult to accept than the stories you have been told." As they were led deeper into the living city that existed inside the bioship, the diplomatic team realized they were about to learn something that would change everything they thought they knew about the Shadow Fleet. The war that had consumed the galaxy and the nature of the beings they had feared above all others. The Void Stalker was not the monster they had believed it to be. It was something far more complex and far more tragic. A protector that had been broken by its duty, a guardian that had lost sight of what it was guarding, and a being that had been waiting centuries for someone to ask the right questions. The truth about the Shadow Fleet was about to emerge, and with it the real story of a war that had never been about conquest at all. The truth about the Shadow Fleet began to unfold in a vast chamber deep inside the bioship, a living room whose walls pulsed gently with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to respond to the emotions of those within it. The Void Stalker stood, at the center, no longer the terrifying weapon of destruction from the battle reports, but a being whose ancient sadness was visible in every line of its transformed form. Around the chamber sat representatives of dozens of species that the galactic community had never seen before. Some were humanoid, others were completely alien, but all of them shared the same weary expression of people who had been running for far too long. "We are not conquerors," the Void Stalker began, its voice carrying the weight of centuries. "We are the last survivors of the Burning War, a conflict that consumed the galactic core before any of your civilizations had developed space travel." Images began to form in the air above them, projections created not by technology, but by the living ship itself. The diplomatic team watched in growing amazement as the true history of the Shadow Fleet revealed itself. Thousands of years ago, the galactic core had been home to dozens of advanced civilizations. They had achieved wonders beyond anything the current galaxy could imagine. Planets transformed into gardens, stars converted into sources of unlimited energy, lifespans measured in millennia rather than decades. But their advancement had attracted something from the dark spaces between galaxies. An infection of pure entropy, beings of anti-life that sought to unmake everything that existed. The war against these entities had lasted for centuries, and slowly, the core civilizations had begun to lose. In desperation, they had created guardians like the Voidstalker, beings enhanced with the power to fight entropy itself. These guardians had been designed as protectors, given the ability to phase through matter to manipulate darkness and light, to survive in the vacuum of space. They were meant to be humanity's last hope against extinction. We won the war, the Voidstalker continued, its form flickering with painful memories. But the victory came at a cost none of us had anticipated. The core worlds were destroyed in the final battles. Our creators, our families, our entire civilizations were gone. We Guardians were left with our programming to protect people who no longer existed. The bioships, they learned, were not weapons of war but evacuation vessels, grown from living technology to carry survivors away from the dying core. For centuries they had wandered the galaxy, looking for new homes for refugees whose worlds had been consumed in the ancient conflict. But the Guardians, designed for war and unable to adapt to peace, had gradually become confused about their mission. Without their creators to guide them, they had begun to see every unknown species as a potential threat. Their attempts to protect the refugees had slowly twisted into aggressive actions against anyone who might pose danger to their charges. We became the very thing we were created to fight, the Voidstalker said, its voice heavy with guilt. Destroyers instead of protectors, monsters instead of guardians. Commander Zeph Cole's crystal body had stopped flashing with anger and now glowed with confusion. But why attack our colonies? Why not simply ask for help? One of the refugee representatives stepped forward, a being whose appearance shifted like flowing water. We tried, it said in a voice like distant music. When we first encountered your civilizations, we attempted diplomatic contact. But we were strange, we were different, and we were many. Your people saw us as invaders rather than refugees. Scout Prime Velthi's 6 arms moved nervously as she processed this information. So, you decided to take what you needed by force? The Voidstalker's form darkened with shame. The Guardians decided. We had been programmed to protect our charges at any cost. When diplomacy failed, when your species showed hostility, we reverted. To our original programming, we became weapons again. Mindspeaker Kelnas leaned forward, his large eyes glowing with the effort of understanding. But the attacks on our colonies were so destructive, entire populations disappeared. Relocated, corrected another refugee, this one resembling a tree made of living crystal. Not destroyed. We moved your people to safety before taking the resources we needed. But in our haste and fear, we made mistakes. Some populations were moved too far from their home environments. Some could not adapt to life aboard our bioships. The full tragedy of the situation began to become clear. The Shadow Fleet attacks had indeed been devastating, but not in the way anyone had understood. They had been desperate attempts by refugees to find new homes, guided by guardians whose programming had been corrupted by centuries of purposeless violence. Deho stood up slowly, his mind processing everything they had learned. The survivors from attacked colonies, he said quietly. What happened to them? The Voidstalker gestured toward one of the chamber's living walls, and it became transparent, revealing vast sections of the bioship beyond. Inside were communities, of beings from dozens of species, including many that the galactic community believed had been wiped out completely. They are here, the Voidstalker said. All of them. We have been caring for them as best we know how, but we are not good at caring for others anymore. We have forgotten how to be gentle. It was Sujin who spoke next, her voice soft but firm. That is why you responded to us differently. When we showed you kindness instead of fear, it reminded you of what you used to be. The Voidstalker turned to look at her, and for a moment its burning eyes seemed almost human. Yes, you treated Us as beings worthy of compassion instead of monsters to be destroyed. You spoke to us as people instead of weapons. For the first time in centuries, we remembered what it felt like to be thanked instead of feared. The other human survivors stepped forward, surrounding the ancient guardian not with threatening gestures, but with open hands and kind expressions. Tae-sung began humming one of his folk songs. Min-ho offered sketches he had drawn during the journey. Dr. Kyunga prepared to share medical knowledge that might help the refugees. Teacher Boram started planning lessons that could help different species understand each other better. But it was Daeho who asked the most important question. What do you want now? Not what your programming tells you to want, but what you choose to want for yourself and your people. The Void Stalker was silent for a long moment, its form shifting as it struggled with concepts it had not considered for centuries. Around the chamber, refugees from dozens of extinct civilizations waited for an answer that would determine the fate of both their people and the galaxy they had been fighting. Finally, the ancient guardian spoke, its voice carrying a hope that had been buried for far too long. We want to go home, it said simply. But home does not exist anymore, so we want to build new homes, together with others who understand what it means to lose everything and start again. We want to protect instead of destroy. We want to create instead of take. We want to be welcomed instead of feared. It paused, looking directly at each of the human representatives. And we want to learn how to be gentle again. Will you teach us? For the first time since the crisis began, the galaxy's greatest threat had asked not for surrender or resources or territory, but for something much simpler and much more powerful. The chance to become better than what they had been forced to become. The diplomatic mission had come seeking to understand their enemy, but they had found something far more valuable. People who needed help remembering how to hope. The decision that would reshape the galaxy began with a simple question from a child. As the diplomatic team toured the refugee sections of the massive bioship, they encountered thousands of beings from civilizations that had been lost to the ancient war. Among them was a young creature that looked like a small tree with glowing fruits for eyes, one of the last members of a species called the Lumini. The child approached Daeho with the curious fearlessness that only children possess and asked, in a voice like wind chimes, "Are you here to take us away from the Dark Guardians?" Daeho knelt down to the child's level, his expression gentle but serious. "Would you like to be taken away?" The small Lumini considered this question with the careful thought of someone far older than their appearance suggested. "The Dark Guardian is sad," they said finally. "It has been sad for so long that it forgot how to smile. I think it needs friends more than we need to be taken away." Out of the mouths of children came wisdom that had eluded entire civilizations. For centuries. Standing nearby, the Voidstalker heard these words, and its ancient form shuddered with an emotion it had not felt in eons. The burning eyes that had terrorized the galaxy grew dim with something that looked almost like tears. "The children understand," it whispered to Daeho. "They see what we have become, but they also remember what we were meant to be." The human diplomat nodded slowly. Children often see truth more clearly than adults because they have not learned to be afraid of hope. Over the following days, as the diplomatic team learned more about the Shadow Fleet's true situation, the complexity of the problem became clear. The refugee crisis was enormous, involving millions of beings from dozens of extinct civilizations. But the resources of the current galaxy were vast, and there were entire worlds that could be shared if the will existed to do so. The real challenge was not practical, but emotional. How do you convince people to welcome those they have been taught to fear? How do you help warriors remember how to be guardians? How do you rebuild trust that has been destroyed by centuries of misunderstanding and conflict? The answer came from humanity's greatest strength, their stubborn refusal to give up on people. Sujin established the first refugee integration program, teaching displaced beings how to communicate with galactic species while also helping those species understand refugee needs. Her simple approach of sharing meals became a model for cultural exchange that would spread across hundreds of worlds. Tae-sung worked with the bioship engineers to understand their living technology, finding ways to adapt it for peaceful purposes. The same systems that had grown warships could also grow hospitals, schools, and homes. His folk songs became the soundtrack for construction projects that built bridges instead of barriers. Dr. Kyung-ah established medical exchange programs, sharing human healing techniques while learning from the advanced biological knowledge of the refugees. Disease and suffering knew no species boundaries, and neither did compassion. Teacher Boram created educational programs that helped different species understand each other's histories, fears, and hopes. She discovered that most conflicts came not from evil intentions but from simple misunderstandings that could be resolved through patient teaching. But it was Dae-ho who faced the most difficult challenge: helping the void. Stalker and the other corrupted guardians remember who they had been before war consumed their purpose. The process was not quick or easy. Centuries of programming designed for combat could not be erased overnight. The guardians struggled with concepts like mercy, patience, and gentleness that seemed to contradict everything they had been trained to do. But slowly, with the help of human teachers and the brave example of refugees who chose trust over fear, the ancient protectors began to change. The Void Stalker was the first to make the complete transformation, its shadowy form solidifying into something that was still powerful, but no longer terrifying. When it finally chose a new name for itself, the ceremony was attended by representatives of every species in the galaxy. Standing before the assembled crowd, the former weapon of destruction spoke in a voice that carried hope instead of menace. "I was created to be a guardian," it said. "I chose to become a monster. Now I choose to become a guardian again. I will be called Protector of the Dawn, because every sunrise is a chance to start over." The Galactic Council, faced with overwhelming evidence of the refugees' peaceful intentions and growing support from their own populations, voted to accept the Shadow Fleet survivors as members of galactic civilization. It was not a unanimous decision, and there were still those who harbored suspicions and fears, but the majority chose hope over hatred, understanding over ignorance. The integration process took years, but it transformed the galaxy in ways no one had expected. Refugee technology revolutionized medicine and agriculture. Their knowledge of stellar engineering led to new forms of clean energy. Their cultural contributions enriched art, philosophy, and science across hundreds of worlds. More importantly, the crisis had taught every species in the galaxy a lesson about the power of empathy over force, understanding over judgment. 5 years after the first diplomatic mission, Ambassador Dae-ho stood on the observation deck of New Haven Station, a massive space habitat built through the cooperation of dozens of species. Below him, he could see children from across the galaxy playing together in gardens grown by bioship technology. Former refugee families had built homes next to beings whose worlds had once been attacked by the Shadow Fleet. Beside him stood the Protector of the Dawn, its form now stable and serene, watching the children with the contentment of a guardian who had finally found something worthy of protecting. "Do you ever regret it?" Dae-ho asked quietly. "Choosing to change instead of remaining as you were?" The ancient being considered the question with the patience of someone who had learned to value peace over power. "I regret the centuries I spent as a monster," it replied. "But I do not regret the choice to become something better." The children laugh now instead of hiding in fear. That is worth more than all the victories I won in battle. Other guardians had made similar choices, working alongside human teachers to establish the Empathy Corps, an organization dedicated to resolving conflicts through understanding rather than force. They served as mediators in disputes that had once seemed impossible to solve, proving again and again that the strongest bonds were formed not through conquest, but through compassion. The galaxy had learned its most important lesson, that the greatest monsters were often just broken heroes who had lost their way, and that the weakest beings could sometimes show the strongest how to find their path home. When children across the galaxy told stories about the Great Crisis, they did not speak of brave warriors who defeated terrible enemies. Instead, they told tales of ordinary humans who looked at the most feared creatures in existence and chose to see people instead of monsters. And in those stories, the moral was always the same: that true strength came not from the ability to destroy, but from the courage to understand, to forgive, and to help others become the best versions of themselves. The galaxy had called humans weak, but in the end, it was that perceived weakness that had saved everyone. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not to fight your enemies, but to help them remember who they used to be, before they became your enemies at all. The Protector of the Dawn had chosen to follow Deho not out of defeat, but out of gratitude for being shown a better way to exist. And in that choice, both Guardian and human had found something that neither conquest nor surrender could provide: the peace that comes from choosing hope over fear, understanding over hatred, and tomorrow over yesterday.